Alrighty, today we're gonna look at everyone's favorite math topic, fractions. Just kidding, no one likes fractions. So, I know this is a huge struggle area, so we're creating a podcast to help you learn some tools to dealing with ratios of fractions, which means figuring out which one's bigger. One of our first tools we're going to use is make a picture. Making fractions into pictures often helps because it helps you visualize what the fraction really is. Second tool we'll use is if the fraction is close to half, seeing which one is closer to half of the whole. Third step we're going to use is doubling the fraction. So sometimes if they don't have a similar denominator, you can double the fraction and it's easier to compare and better to look at. And then last, we're going to look at obvious fractions that's just common sense. I can tell this one's bigger than the next. Alrighty, so our first tool, which can be done with smaller fractions, is make a picture. The first fractions we're going to compare is 1/4 versus 1/3. Now, we want to see which one of these fractions is larger. So, as discussed before, we are going to draw a picture. So here is our 1/4. So we have a circle divided into 4, and we have filled in one of those. And our next fraction is going to be 1/3. So circle divided into 3, and we have 1 filled in. Now, looking at the picture, it makes it almost obvious that 1/3 is larger because more of the circle is filled in. Now, for our second fraction, we're going to make it a tiny bit more complicated. We're going to compare 3/4 versus 3/8. Oops, 7/8. Alrighty, so when we draw our 3/4 circle, we have 3 filled in out of 4. And for our 7/8, we're drawing a circle. We're going to break it into 8 different pieces, and we're going to fill in 7 of them. Now, when we look at this in the picture, it makes it pretty obvious that there is more in the 7/8. More of the circle is filled in. Pictures are often great tools when working with fractions. The only problem with pictures is if you have to do 11/17, it's going to be hard to break that circle into 17 small pieces. So usually this tool is better for small, more drawable fractions.
So for our next tool that we're going to give you, we're going to look at fractions that are really close to 1/2. The first two that we're going to compare are going to be 4/6 and 1/2. And 1/2, you can see, takes up half of one circle. 4/6, after looking at the diagram, you can see takes up just a hair more than 1/2, showing that 4/6 is in fact greater than 1/2. And then for our next fraction, which is really tricky to draw, is going to be 4/9. Any volunteers for drawing that one? So now that we have our circle divided into 9 equal parts, we're going to color in 4 of them. And you might think, okay, 4/9 is a really big number, but in all reality, 4 is much further away from 9 than 1 is from 2. So when you look at what half of 9 is and what half of 2 is, 4/9 is actually smaller than 1/2. Now that we've looked at having fractions, or fractions that are really close to 1/2, we're going to go the other way and double some fractions to get similar denominators. And our first fraction we're going to look at is 3/4. And we're going to compare it with 5/8. And you might be able to see that 4 doubled is actually going to be 8. And when it comes to fractions, you have to double both the denominator and the numerator. And the numerator is the top number. After doubling these fractions to have like denominators, it's much easier to see that 6 is larger than 5 to make a comparison between 6/8 and 5/8. Our second set of fractions that we're going to work with are going to be 5/6 and 11/12. Both of these are really close to 1 whole. So to make it a little easier to compare them, we're going to double 5/6. And once again, we double both the numerator and the denominator. And afterwards, we can see that 10/12 compared to 11/12, that 11/12 is larger than 10/12. Finally, we're going to compare 7/14 and 4/7. And after doubling, oh, we're going to say doubling the 14? We are not doubling the 14, we're going to double the 7. To establish a denominator of 14, and after also doubling the 4, that becomes 8. And can anybody see that 8 is larger than 7? So 4/7 is much larger than 7/14.
Alrighty, so for our last section, we are going to look at obvious fractions and review the tools we know now. First, we're going to look at 2/12 versus 7/24. Now, out of our tools that we've been taught today, this we can tell 12 is half of 24, so we can possibly use our doubling tool, which means 2/12 and can be rewritten as 2/24, which is pretty much obvious that that is smaller than 7/24. I know some of you may want to use the tool of actually writing it out to compare, but if this is something you can do in your head and quickly, it's a great tool to have that'll make doing homework and tests a little more speedier. The next fraction we're going to look at is 3/4 versus 2/5. Now, this is one where we can compare to half. So, 3/4 is bigger than a half. It's 3 out of 4. And then 2/5 is less than a half. Half of 5 would be 2.5. So, after using this reasoning, we know that 3/4 is a bigger fraction than 2/5. Next, we'll look at 1/2 versus 1/3. Now, since these are our simple fractions, we could either draw them ourselves or picture them in our minds. I know for me, drawing seems to be a good tool, but now after experience, I can picture that fraction in my mind. So I know if I picture half a circle filled in with only 2 pieces versus 1 piece of a circle filled in out of 3 pieces, I know that the half is larger than the third. Alrighty, now let's move on to 2 more examples. We have 3/5 versus 7/10. Now this one, we can either double and use that as a strategy. So we have 6/10 out of 7/10, or we can use the compare to half. Now, when we compare to half, we know 3 out of 5 is more than half, and 7 out of 10 is more than half. But 7 out of 10 is much more of the half of 10 than 3 out of 5 is. This is something where we can use our skills and look for obvious that 7 out of 10 is greater than 3 out of 5. Now last, we are going to compare 2 7s versus 5 7s. Now this one should just be obvious by this point in your math career that if you have a circle, if we're picturing it out of a picture, broken into 7 pieces, 2 out of the 7 pieces filled in versus 5 out of the 7 pieces filled in would be obvious to us that the 5 out of the 7 filled in would be much greater. So instead of having to take the time to draw it, as we are now, we don't have to do that. We can just know by picturing in our mind and having worked with fractions so much that 5 7s would be greater than 2 7s. I know fractions can be very tricky, and it's a skill that you somewhat have to practice and keep working on. But as long as you're willing to use your tools and keep trying, fractions will become something that you understand and have knowledge and confidence in. And maybe even have fun figuring out which fraction is larger than the other. Now let's review our tools one more time. One tool we have is make a picture. Another tool we have is compare each fraction to half and see if it's close to half. A third tool we have is double the fraction and then compare it. And then lastly, we have look for the obvious. With these tools, you'll be well on your way to comparing fractions.